The auction block in Copper Ridge was supposed to be for cattle and horses, but Marcus Stone knew better. He'd seen the notice posted outside the saloon 3 days ago, written in code that wasn't really code at all. Special merchandise. Private. Bidding. Cash only. In a territory where law enforcement was bought and sold like everything else, human trafficking hid behind legitimate business in broad daylight. Marcus had come to town for supplies, but the crowd gathering behind the livestock corrals told him something else was happening, something that made his stomach turn and his hands shake with a rage he hadn't felt since the war. The girl couldn't have been older than 19, chained at the wrists and ankles, standing on a wooden platform while men examined her like they would a prize mare. Her dark skin and traditional clothing marked her as Native American, probably taken during one of the raids that had been plaguing reservations for months. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold. They weren't broken or pleading, they were furious. Even in chains, even surrounded by men who saw her as property, she stood with the dignity of someone who refused to be reduced to what others tried to make her. Marcus recognized some of the bidders, wealthy ranchers from 3 counties over, mine owners who needed workers they didn't have to pay, even a few supposedly respectable businessmen from the territorial capital. The auctioneer was Jake Morrison, a man who'd made his fortune selling everything from stolen cattle to military supplies to whoever paid the highest price. Morrison called the crowd to order and began describing the girl's qualities like she was livestock. Young, strong, good for field work or domestic service. Bidding started at $50. The numbers climbed quickly. 75, 100, 125. Marcus felt sick listening to grown men argue over the price of another human being. He'd fought in the Civil War supposedly to end slavery, but here in the lawless territories, the practice continued under different names. Indentured servitude, debt labor, contract work. The words changed, but the reality remained the same. People bought and sold other people, and the authorities looked the other way as long as they got their cut. Marcus had been living alone on his ranch for 7 years since his wife died of influenza. He'd sworn off getting involved in other people's troubles after the war had shown him how cruel human beings could be to each other. He kept to himself, raised cattle, and tried to forget the things he'd seen during 4 years of fighting. But watching this girl stand defiant in chains brought back memories of why he'd enlisted in the first place. Some things were worth fighting. For even when the fight seemed hopeless, the bidding reached $200 with no signs of slowing down. The girl kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look at the men deciding her fate. But Marcus caught her glance for just a moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or desperation. She didn't know him, but she could see he was different from the others. He wasn't evaluating her worth or calculating her usefulness. He was seeing her as a person in trouble who needed help. Marcus had $400 in his pocket, money he'd saved for winter supplies and ranch improvements, more than enough to outbid anyone else interested in buying a human being. The question was whether he could live with himself if he walked away. Whether he could go back to his quiet ranch and pretend he'd never seen the fury and dignity in that girl's eyes. Whether saving one person was worth the danger it would bring to his door. The auctioneer called for final bids, $250 from a mine owner who was known for working his laborers to death, $275 from a rancher whose previous workers had a habit of disappearing when they demanded wages. Marcus felt his hand moving before his brain had made the decision. $300, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. The auctioneer's hammer paused mid-swing. Every head turned to look at the stranger who'd just changed everything. Marcus's bid silenced the crowd for exactly 3 seconds before chaos erupted. Men shouted competing offers, but the girl's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made everything else fade into background noise. 350, someone yelled. 400, Marcus countered, without hesitation. The mine owner cursed and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. The rancher, known for disposing of workers, threw his hat down in disgust. Marcus kept raising his hand until the bidding stopped at $600, more money than most of these men saw in a year. Jake Morrison's grin revealed gold teeth as he declared Marcus the winner. Cash up front, no credit, no questions asked. Marcus counted out the bills while trying not to think about what he'd just done. $600 would have bought winter feed for his entire herd, new tools for spring planting, maybe even a few breeding bulls to improve his stock. Instead, he just purchased a human being in broad daylight, while a crowd of witnesses watched him do it. The girl said nothing as Morrison unlocked her leg shackles, but left the wrist chains in place. Standard practice, he explained, with a businessman's casual cruelty. New owners preferred to handle their own security arrangements. Marcus wanted to break Morrison's nose, but starting a fight would only make things worse for both of them. He accepted the chain's key and a bill of sale that made his stomach turn. Legal documentation of an illegal transaction, signed and witnessed as if buying people was just another form of commerce. Walking toward his wagon with the girl beside him, Marcus became aware of how many eyes were following their progress. Some curious, some calculating, some openly hostile. Word would spread quickly that the hermit rancher from Dead Horse Creek had bought himself an Indian girl. Speculation would run wild about his intentions and motivations. In a territory where reputation was the difference between being left alone and being targeted by every outlaw and opportunist, Marcus had just painted a target on his back. The girl climbed into his wagon without assistance, moving with a fluid grace that her chains couldn't completely restrict. Up close, Marcus could see that she was beautiful in the way that wild creatures are beautiful, but it was her intelligence that struck him most. Her dark eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail of their surroundings, every face in the crowd, every possible escape route. She was planning something, and Marcus suspected it would happen sooner rather than later. They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving Copper Ridge behind for the open desert that stretched endlessly toward Marcus's ranch. The girl studied him as openly as he'd studied her, taking his measure with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. Finally, she spoke in accented English that was clearer and more educated than Marcus had expected. "You are not like the others," she said, "but you still bought me like cattle. Why?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question. "Because it was wrong," he answered honestly. "Because I couldn't watch it happen and do nothing." The girl considered this for a long moment. "My name is Kaya," she said. "I am not cattle, and I am not property, and I will not be a slave no matter how much money you paid." Marcus stopped the wagon and turned to face her. "I know," he said, pulling the key from his pocket. "That's why I'm going to unlock these chains right now." Kaya watched suspiciously as Marcus freed her wrists, expecting some trick or condition that would make her freedom temporary. But he simply pocketed the chains and resumed driving. "You can leave whenever you want," he told her. "I won't stop you. Stop. But if you have nowhere to go, you're welcome to stay at my ranch until you figure out your next move. No conditions, no expectations, just a safe place to recover and make plans." Kaya rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed her skin. "Where is your ranch?" she asked. "About 6 hours south," Marcus replied. "Good water, decent shelter, and far enough from town that people mostly leave me alone." Kaya nodded slowly. "I will come with you," she decided. "But not because you own me. Because I choose to." Marcus understood the distinction, and it made all the difference in the world. Marcus's ranch was smaller than Kaya had expected, but well maintained. with a sturdy house built from local stone and timber that had weathered decades of desert storms. She studied everything with the eye of someone trained to evaluate defensive positions and escape routes. The corral gates were solid, the barn had multiple exits, and the well was positioned where it could be defended if necessary. This was not the home of a man who trusted easily or lived carelessly. Kaya had been taken during a raid on her village 3 weeks earlier, sold twice before ending up on Morrison's auction block. She'd grown up as the daughter of a tribal leader, educated in both traditional ways and English customs by missionaries who'd respected her people's culture. She could read, write, and negotiate in 2 languages, skills that had made her valuable to the men who'd enslaved her. Skills she planned to use to ensure her freedom and revenge. Marcus showed her to a small room that had obviously belonged, and to a woman. Feminine touches remained in the curtains and quilt, though dust suggested the space had been unused for years. "Your wife?" Kaya asked, touching a silver hairbrush on the dresser. Marcus nodded but didn't elaborate. Kaya understood. Grief and the silence it created. She'd lost family too, though under different circumstances. Some wounds were too deep for words between strangers. Over the next few days, Kaya proved herself far from helpless. She could handle horses better than most men, cook with ingredients Marcus hadn't known were edible, and repair gear with techniques he'd never seen. She also revealed a sharp intelligence that had been hidden behind the submission her captors expected. She asked detailed questions about local geography, trade routes, and the political relationships between ranchers, tribal lands, and territorial authorities. Marcus began to suspect that Kaya's presence on his ranch was about more than finding temporary shelter. She was gathering information for something specific, though she kept her intentions to herself. He didn't press for details, understanding that trust was earned slowly and that someone who'd been betrayed and sold would be cautious about sharing plans with anyone, even someone who'd helped them. The trouble Marcus had been expecting arrived. On their 5th day together, 6 men rode up to his house just after dawn, led by Vernon Crawford, the mine owner who'd been outbid at the auction. Crawford was known for getting what he wanted through intimidation when money wasn't enough. His men were the kind of hired guns who asked no questions and left no witnesses when their work was done. Crawford didn't waste time with pleasantries. He wanted to buy Kaya from Marcus for $800, claiming he had important work that required her specific skills. When Marcus refused, Crawford's tone became openly threatening. He mentioned how isolated Marcus's ranch was, how accidents happened to men who didn't understand their place in the local order, how easy it would be for someone to disappear completely in the vast desert. Kaya emerged from the house in confrontation, moving with the fluid grace Marcus had noticed before. But now she carried herself differently, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command rather than servitude. She spoke to Crawford in perfect English, her voice carrying an authority that made even his hired guns take notice. She told him that she was not for sale, would never be for sale, and that any man who tried to take her by force would regret the attempt. Crawford laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. Something about Kaya's confidence unsettled him. He tried to reassert control by threatening Marcus again, but Kaya stepped forward and spoke quietly to Crawford in a native language Marcus didn't recognize. Crawford's face went pale. Whatever she'd said had shaken him badly. He mounted his horse and ordered his men to follow, but not before promising that this wasn't over. After they'd gone, Marcus asked what Kaya had told Crawford. She smiled for the first time since he'd known her. "I told him my real name and my father's name," she said. "I told him that 6 warriors from my tribe are already tracking the men who took me, and that they will find this place soon. I told him that when they arrive, they will remember the faces of everyone who threatened the daughter of Chief Red Bear." Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about Kaya was wrong. She wasn't just a victim who needed rescuing. She was bait in a trap that was about to close on everyone who'd participated in her capture and sale. And Marcus, by helping her, had become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue. The warriors arrived 3 days later, appearing at dawn like shadows given form. Marcus counted 12 of them, though he suspected there were more he couldn't see. They moved with the practiced silence of men who'd been tracking enemies across hostile territory for weeks. Their leader was a tall man with silver streaking his black hair and scars that told stories of battles survived. When he saw Kaya, his stern expression softened with relief and unmistakable paternal love. Kaya ran to him, speaking rapidly in her native language, gesturing toward Marcus and the house where she'd found safety. The man listened intently, then approached Marcus with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. He introduced himself as Chief Red Bear and thanked Marcus in careful English for protecting his daughter when she needed help most. But his eyes held a hardness that suggested gratitude wouldn't extend to mercy for those who'd wronged his family. Chief Red Bear explained that Kaya's capture hadn't been random. She'd been specifically targeted because of her education and her role as a translator in treaty negotiations between tribal councils and territorial authorities. The men who'd taken her were part of a larger conspiracy to disrupt those negotiations, believing that without skilled mediators, they could force more favorable terms for mining and railroad interests. Kaya's enslavement was both revenge and strategic warfare. The chief had been tracking the trafficking network for months, following a trail that led from reservation raids to auction houses to the powerful men who financed the entire operation. Morrison's auction had been under surveillance for weeks. Every bidder, every transaction, every participant had been catalogued and investigated. Now it was time for justice to be served, according to laws older than territorial courts and more final than prison sentences. Marcus realized he'd been part of something much larger than a rescue. By buying Kaya, he'd not only saved her, but also provided the final piece of evidence the warriors needed to identify the network's local leadership. His receipt from Morrison, combined with witness testimony from other victims, would be enough to bring federal attention to crimes that territorial authorities had been ignoring or enabling for profit. Over the next week, justice came swiftly and quietly to those who'd participated in the trafficking ring. Morrison was found dead in his office, apparently killed during a robbery that left his records and cash untouched. Crawford disappeared from his mine, leaving behind a foreman's report about cave-ins and accidents that claimed the lives of several workers who'd been asking too many questions about missing people. Other network participants simply vanished, their fate known only to the desert and the men who served as its executioners. Kaya stayed at Marcus's ranch during the cleanup, but both of them knew her time there was temporary. She had responsibilities to her people that couldn't be ignored, treaty negotiations that needed her skills, and a future that stretched far beyond the boundaries of his small property. But the days they spent together taught them both something important about courage, trust, and the connections that form between people who choose to do what's right, despite the cost. On her last evening at the ranch, Kaya helped Marcus repair a section of fence that had been damaged during one of the desert's frequent windstorms. They worked in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned to communicate as much through shared effort as through words. She told him that her father had offered to make him an honorary member of their tribe, a recognition given to few outsiders, and only to those who'd proven their honor through significant sacrifice. Marcus was touched by the offer, but declined, explaining that his place was on the ranch his wife had loved, tending the land and animals that had become his responsibility. But he asked Kaya to remember that she would always have a safe place with him if she ever needed one. Some friendships, he'd learned, were strong enough to survive distance and time, built on shared values rather than shared circumstances. Chief Red Bear left Marcus with a gift before departing with his daughter and warriors. A beautifully carved rifle stock made from wood that grew only on tribal lands, etched with symbols that represented protection and friendship. The chief explained that it marked Marcus as someone under the protection of Red Bear's people, a designation that would be recognized and honored by native communities throughout the territory. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter delivered by a tribal courier. Kaya wrote that the treaty negotiations had been successful, establishing protections for sacred lands and fair compensation for resource extraction on tribal territory. The trafficking network had been completely dismantled, with federal authorities finally taking action after overwhelming evidence made ignoring the crimes impossible. Several territorial officials had been arrested, and new laws were being written to prevent similar abuses. Marcus continued working his ranch alone, but he no longer felt isolated from the larger world around him. He'd learned that standing up for what's right creates connections that transcend cultural boundaries and personal circumstances. His small act of courage had contributed to justice for people he'd never meet and protections that would benefit future generations. Sometimes, late at night when the desert wind carried distant sounds across his land, Marcus thought he could hear voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, but the words felt like gratitude and friendship. The carved rifle stock hung above his fireplace, a reminder that courage doesn't require understanding every consequence of our actions. Sometimes it's enough to see something wrong and decide to act, trusting that goodness creates more goodness and that standing with the oppressed is always the right choice, regardless of the personal cost. Did this story of unexpected heroism and cross-cultural justice move you? If you enjoyed seeing how one man's courage could dismantle an entire network of evil, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that prove ordinary people can create extraordinary change. Share in the comments what you would have done in Marcus's situation, and let us know what other stories of unexpected heroism you'd like to hear. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these inspiring tales that remind us we all have the power to make a difference when we choose courage over comfort.